sense of really how big it. You can't tell from models and pictures.
Yeah. How do you get up there?
Actually, what would typically happen to get on board, the flaps would be lowered, and there's a step in the flap, and you get up onto the wing, and then you can see a footstep in the bottom of the black line, and then there's another footstep above that, and then into the cockpit. This particular version is initially was called AD5, and then it was A1 or AE1Q. Yeah. Anyway, we had 3 of these on board the Coral Sea, but they had the radar dome underneath them. The radar dome underneath them was huge. It basically expanded between the 2 landing gear and came out to about here and almost on the ground. And it basically, we referred to them as guppies because they looked like a big pregnant guppy. And they didn't have really any armament on them. Some of them did have one 20mm cannon, but their primary thing was endurance. So they would carry typically the radar dome, and then there was a wing mount out here. You can kind of see what's left of it there, that they could put a large fuel tank. So they would carry 2 external fuel tanks, and that would give them an endurance of about 9 hours. And they were just basically radar for like early warning, and we used those until basically there was another version of radar, and that was the S2, that was sometimes called a stoof with a roof because it had a big radar dome on top of it, and then that was superseded by the E2, which was a turboprop version, and they are still using those today. Those are very sophisticated planes, and then they have another version that's kind of being modified for that now in the Navy. At the time I was aboard, we had 1 squadron of A1s, and there were 14 airplanes in the squadron, and there were 2 A4 squadrons, which is a small jet, and then we had 2 fighter squadrons that had F4s, so there were a total of 5 combat squadrons. And then there were called detachments. So a detachment typically had 2 to 3 airplanes in it, or birds. And we had a reconnaissance, and those were F8 Crusader jets. And we had 3 of those, and we had 3 helicopters, and the 3, it's politically incorrect, but they were sometimes called queer Spads because they were 85Q. Go figure. Back in that day, it didn't matter. But the bottom line is that they were a great bird, and they were absolutely important to the rest of the flying because you got to keep track of the MiGs, because the MiGs, if they were going to come out, were going to be a problem. And they also used it to spot PT boats periodically until even way into my cruise, which was 67, 68. They would periodically come out with PT boats and make a run at the carrier group. They'd never get very close because there would be somebody on top of them ready to blow them out of the water, and sometimes we did. But they were hard to catch at night, but the BAQs could spot them on the water, and that was great. So we were very close to them, all the pilots, because we were all SPAD pilots, and that was a great camaraderie.
Where did the name SPAD come from? How did they get hung on this point?
Because the initial designation after prototype was for the AD1, and that was the Navy's way of naming airplanes was to identify what kind of plane it was and then who built it. So if it was SB-2C, it was a SB Scout Bomber. C was Curtiss Air, and then the Model 2. In the AD, it was Attack, Douglas, and 1. And so in about, I think it was about 58 or 59, they changed the designations to the A1, and then the A1 had various alpha characters after it, the A1, A, B, C, D, E, things like that. And then they were also had the version numbers, which then what was an AD1 became the A1, and by that time they were pretty much either gone or had been superseded and rebuilt into something else. So that
Did this plane come with an autopilot?
it actually had an autopilot. We didn't trust them a lot, but it had it, and it had a radar altimeter, which we also didn't trust a lot. It had 2 TACAN radios for and an ADF. So the TACAN is same as what we're familiar with now. It gave you a range or a bearing and a distance from the station, which gave you as close to GPS as we ever got. And the AD or the ADF was a radio station like you hear on standard AM radios, and you would dial that in, which was always tricky because you had to listen for it, and then when you found it, you had to know Morse code so that you'd know which station you were dialing into, and then it would give you an arrow to that station so that you could draw a bearing out from that, and you'd get another station and draw a bearing and say, oh, this is where I am, which is a lot of work because you're still flying the airplane. And that was one of the challenges of the A1 for the single pilot versions, is that you were everything. You were the pilot, you were the navigator, you were the radio operator, you were the weapons officer, and chaplain. So we really needed that position on night landings. Those were usually the ones that were the scariest, because when you're looking at the aircraft carrier, all you see is some little data lights, and it's out there somewhere, and everything else is black. Yeah, and it's easy to get vertigo and not know where you are or where the wings are and those kind of things. So it was a great airplane to fly. It's big. It's 50-foot wingspan. Empty. It weighed about 10,000 pounds. Put fuel in it and a pilot, and it kicked up to almost 14. And by the time you put ordnance on, we could actually take off the carrier with as much as 25,000 pounds. So the A1 was the first airplane to ever carry its own airframe weight in ordnance. So it weighed about 10,000 pounds, and it could carry 10,000 pounds of ordnance. And which in normal loads, it was typically about 6,500 pounds up to 7,500 pounds. And again, the 7,500 pounds of ordnance is basically what a B-17 carried. So it was very effective, and I'll tell you more about the history when we go inside. Do you have any questions being out here? Yes.
I've got a question. You've got a little ring behind the propeller in front of the crank.
Yes.
What the hell is that?
That's the propeller governor.
Oh, the governor's in that.
And it actually is filled with hydraulic fluid. I know that because I had a governor failure off the cat once, because somehow it leaked hydraulic fluid, and so all I had to do there was no way to have enough power to wave off if I had a problem. So I had to go in from the carrier on Yankee Station to Chulai, the Marine base there. Had to land there, and fortunately there was an old grizzled gunnery sergeant, and it was a Marine base, and he was a mechanic, a young mechanic in Korea. And so he comes out there and takes a look. Oh hell, you're missing. Oh well, we'll get you a new screw in there. We'll pull her back up. So they did that, and then I was able to fly back to the ship. But yeah, that's from General.
One of the few airplanes that doesn't have a Hamilton standard prop, isn't it?
Yeah. Let's see. I cannot remember now what the model is. It's a 14-foot diameter prop, and if you can see, imagine this, and then imagine it up on its tail. There wasn't a lot of play for the deck, so you couldn't nose it over too far. You'd be pranging the deck and tearing up the engine, which was the cruise speed was typically 178 knots at cruise. It had a faster cruise at 238, and it had a red line speed of 450. That would be in a power on dive, and those were scary. the engine itself are two banks of 9 cylinders, and it has a total 3,350 cubic inch, generating roughly 2,700 horsepower. But when you threw the alcohol water mixture to it, it jumped to 2,900 horsepower. Yeah, you could only do that for about 5 minutes, and then you had to go show yourself up to the maintenance officer and explain to him why you had to do that. Because it's hard on the engine. I had to try to get them all the way through because they were going away. They didn't want to overtrain too many pilots because they knew when the airplane goes away, so does your career back. So they didn't want to have too many of them, but they wanted enough to fill the slots that they would have. Are there any other questions out here where it's cold? Some people are okay. Let's go on back. Well, it says retired, but it was really not really retired. I wish I would have been retired because that would have been a nice thing to be. Actually, I, along with a bunch of people, were RIF'd in 1969 when they were winding down Vietnam. And so anybody that was not flying a combat or a fleet plane at that time was relieved of their obligation because the Navy did not have the money to retrain them into a fleet type. And the only thing I could have done is stayed as an instructor, which I asked for, but they said, oh no, you need sea duty. Well, but you don't have an airplane for me to fly. I guess you have to get out. So it's one of those things. Anyway, but I was on inactive reserve for a number of years, and finally, somewhere along the lane, I got a letter saying that I was relieved of my inactive reserve requirement. So that's retirement. It's too hard to try to explain that on a flyer, so just retired is close enough. Right now, I'm just tired. Anyway, it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be among fellow aviation people that are interested in that, and thank you very much for coming out this evening and supporting the museum. I've been here a couple of times, just not in the last year, and it's a very neat experience walking among the airplanes, and actually I'm looking very much forward to an RV trip later this month that will take me down through Tucson and the Boneyard, and that will be very exciting. I've seen it from the air, I've driven by it, but I've never actually walked through it, and we've got a tour lined up and the rest of that, so that will be fun. Last year I was able, my squadron, VA-25, had reunions every 2 years, and last year it was in Dallas, Texas, or a year and a half ago. It was in Dallas, Texas, and we went through the huge, it's at the it's at the Fort Worth Naval Air Station for the F-35 factory, and Lockheed Marriott, isn't that the one that does it now, or is it Boeing? I can't remember now. But it was incredible because that assembly line was a mile long, and the overhead crane would start at one end of the building and go from station to station for a mile, do a U-turn, and come back another mile, putting parts on as it went away, and they would have the specification kind of riding on the carriage, and so they could turn it into an Air Force or a Navy or a Marine pilot plane, rather, or build it for the Israeli Navy or whatever they would. The specifications were specific for the vendor, and they would build it to order, in essence. So each plane came off as it was requested. So that was pretty amazing to see the curvature of the earth inside of a hangar. That was the hardest part. Anyway, what I'd like to do is talk to you about the A-1, and the historical development of the A-1 was initially there was the Douglas Dauntless. And the Douglas Dauntless was the primary dive bomber of the Navy for the first 3.5 years of of World War II, and it is in fact the one that caused the destruction of the Navy, or the Imperial Navy's carriers at Midway. It was the one responsible for destroying a number of primary battleships. It was a great plane, and they needed to replace it. And the Navy was going through all kinds of throes of this was 1944-45 time frame. What they wanted was a multi-mission airplane. Prior to that, they had dive bombers that did dropping of bombs, and they had torpedo bombers that dropped torpedoes from low altitude. And any of you that remember the movie or have read about Midway, the thing that caused the success of that was the fact that the torpedo bombers went in low and drew down all the fighters, and they were shot up. In fact, there was only one person that came out of this one squadron. Out of 15 planes, there was one individual survivor that floated around for a long time before he was picked up. They were all shot down, but in the process, it brought all the combat air patrol Zeros down to the deck, and the dive bombers came in and had a free run at the ships, and that's what made the difference, really. So they wanted an airplane that could either be a scout, which went out and had a long duration so they could go out and look for things, or could be a torpedo bomber or be a dive bomber. And so they put out the specs, and there were a number of things going on. And at that time, the Curtiss Helldiver was one that was being looked at. The problem with the competitors for that is they were all 2 or 3 crew airplanes, and the Navy was thinking, couldn't we just get by with 1 crew, because that would be cheaper to train and easier to maintain, fewer people to have to be dealing with. And so Ed Heinemann, who developed the Dauntless, went to Washington in the tail end of the whole process. He worked for Douglas Aviation, and he designed the Dauntless. And he went in and got the wind from talking to the Navy at that time that they were going to not win the competition unless they could come up with a couple specs. And so he and his cohort retired to the hotel room that night, and on napkins and other things drew a proposal and came in the next day. And it was interesting enough that the Navy said, well, we'll give you another month to try to see what you can come up with. So they put together a plan for it, and sure enough, they won the contract, and that's why the A1 became the A1. And it was initially, the prototype version was the XBT-2D1, sometimes referred to as the Destroyer 2. And there were 3 to 5 of those built, and enough to prove the concept and show that it did work. And then that became the AD-1, which had an R3350, which is a 3,350 cubic inch Wright Cyclone engine, the same engine that you find in the B-17, or excuse me, B-29, and the Constellation. Super Connies had those as well. And at that time, that was the largest engine put in a single engine airplane. And it's a big airframe. Those of you who went out there, 50-foot wingspan. It throws a 4-foot, 14-foot diameter prop. That initial engine basically had 2,500 horsepower, and it later became the AD2 became the Sky Shark, which is they took the A-frame, or the frame from the A2, and they put a turboprop on it. And it had a problem because it had a pair of jet engines running a common gearbox that had a counter-rotating prop on it. And it never quite worked well because things kept breaking. And when things break on the power system like that, it's not a good thing. So the idea was, at the time, they really wanted to go to something that had a turboprop so it could be jet powered, so they could get rid of gasoline powered planes off the carrier deck. The problem, those of you that have read any World War II stuff, the problem with aircraft carriers primarily was fires, and the fires were predominantly fed by aviation fuel, and then resulted in cooking off ordnance, which then took big hunks of the ship apart. And the avgas is much more flammable than JP4, so they would be glad to get rid of that. And plus, the avgas is very high octane, so it burns real hot and real fast. So that was that development. The AD3 became, as I said, the Skyshark turboprop, and then they moved on to the 4. The problem they discovered was that the 80s, the 81s, needed to have their landing gear beefed up for carrier operations, and they needed to beef up the airframe to handle the G-loading and pulling out of dive bombing. So they beefed it up, and then they also went from 2 20-millimeter cannon to 4 20-millimeter cannon in the wings. And that was the kind of the core of the AD for a while. They then came up with the AD5, which is what you saw outside there. This is a model of one, and it has a wide body, if you will, and you can sit side by side, and they had various variants of this. They could sit a pilot and a radar intercept officer, and then they could put several electronic counter warfare technicians in the back seat, so they would have a crew of 4. And some of the versions also had it a solid, and they actually had it set up as an ambulance, and they could put 4 litters inside the fuselage. And then some of them were set up for, they could carry 8 crewmen, 4 facing each other in very tight quarters in that. So they had a couple variants of that. And that's the 85. And then the 86 was totally beefed up with a larger engine, and this represents that. And then along came the changing from the AD to the A1, and then they went through various alphabetic models of that. So the AD, what had been AD1s became A1As, and the 2s became Bs and Cs there. And so what I flew was the 6 and 7 version, which were the H and J models. And by the time I flew it in 67, they were virtually indistinguishable, because what had happened for the 86, it was primarily designed, it was one of the second one, or actually the first one that was modified to carry nuclear weapons. And I don't hear anybody going, nuclear weapons? In a propeller plane? Okay. But the 87 came along, and it had enhancements to low-level nuclear delivery, which is even more exciting. And then they retroed the 6s to the same capability as the 7. Now, the interesting thing about all that was that for about a 3-year period in the middle 50s after Korea, the A1 was the primary nuclear strategic attack weapon of the Navy, because none of the jets that could carry nuclear weapons had the range where they could get out far enough and get back. We could get out far enough and get back, it just took us several days to get there. Maybe not quite, but it seemed like that. Anyway, and I'll talk to you more about that. This is a picture of 405 in all of her resplendent glory in the Naval Aviation Museum, which, if you ever get down to Pensacola, is a wonderful museum in of itself. It has an area that simulates the hangar deck, so they got the planes and how they would be maintained, and they've got everything imaginable hanging all over the place, and there's a real collection. On this particular one, when we'll talk a little bit about the ordnance later, but this is a 750-pound bomb that has the explosive power of a 1,000-pound bomb from World War II, because the explosives were improved, but it was 250 pounds less with the same hitting power. Plus, the streamline of that as opposed to the real bulbous 1,000 pounder made it better for penetrating when you had to do that. And then these out here are a combination of 500 and 250 pound bombs. And this is what they call a Lao 60 rocket pad. You can see that it has 19 sleeves inside of it for 2.75-inch rockets that are about this long. And they have a warhead that's almost 3 inches. And it carries about 6 pounds of explosive, which is equivalent to about 4 to 6 hand grenades. And they had various types of warheads in those, and some of them were basically white phosphorus, and some of them were explosive, and some of them were flechettes, where they would have 400 little darts that they would throw out for anti-personnel. And those 19 rockets like that, you could fire them off either individually or ripple or like a shotgun. So they were pretty impressive, and that was really about the closest thing to anti-aircraft that we had, because what we would hope is we could turn inside of a MiG and shoot every rocket in the world at them, and they'd have to fly through a whole bunch of rockets to see if they could get out the other side. And you just like firing a shotgun with a lot. This is a 300-pound external gas tank. There was a 300-gallon external gas tank, and there's 400 gallons behind the pilot, which made it interesting if you had to bail out. If it was on fire, you had to kind of be an act from Las Vegas, dive through the flames. And this is a small cockpit or canopy as opposed to the wide one that you have out there. And you can see that here. It's almost the size of a P-51 Mustang bubble. And it slid back from here back. And then the primary way for the first half of the cruise was if you had to bail out, you unbuckled yourself from the seat and hopefully not your parachute as well. And then you would open the canopy and you would crouch down in your seat, and then you would pull yourself over the edge of the cockpit there and try to duck under the horizontal stabilizer so that you didn't end up skewed or wrapped around it. It was always exciting to imagine that. I never had to do that. Later in the cruise, they went to the Stanley machine company, tool company, made the Yankee extraction system. And it was a really interesting thing. It had a rocket motor mounted behind your head, kind of going back in there, that had a head on it with 2 little ports. And what you would do is there was a bungee between your legs, a loop, and if you had to extract, you would pull on the bungee, and the bungee would fire using primer cord, would shoot primer cord around and blow the canopy off, and then it would fire another thing, would cause that rocket to erect, and then ignite the rocket, and then it would pull you out on a 10-foot long bungee onto your harness and the seat would fall free. And the really cool thing about that is it all happened in about 2 seconds. So you really hope they knew what they were doing with the primer cord. Because if the canopy did not blow off, the system would not erect, and you were back to crawling around in the seat and diving over the side of the airplane. Now, the good thing about the Yankee seat was that it basically had 0-0 capability. You could be sitting on the deck and pull that thing, and it would pull you up far enough and then deploy the chute that you could actually survive, they promised us. And fortunately, I did never have to see that. It also had the capability, supposedly, as long as you were under 200 knots and you were at least 100 feet in the air, you could even get out inverted, because it would come out in that 10 feet, pull you out, and then your body acted like a pendulum to right it up, and then it would go up in the air, and then poof, your chute would come out, and then you drift back down again, maybe for a half a second. Anyway.
How many people actually bail out of it?
I think there was only one use of the Yankee. As far as the bailing out, it wasn't real common, because what happened typically, if you were still alive in the plane, you typically tried to crash land it, because the beauty of the airplane is you have an awful lot of steel in front of you when you're coming in like that. And as long as you don't, as long as you have control in the wings, the chances are that you'll survive even if you smack down a couple of trees. But there weren't a lot of bailouts of A1s. I'm thinking, I heard and read of probably a half dozen on the Navy side. I don't know how many of the Air Force, because the Air Force flew these as well. Good question. Okay, so that's 405. This is the instrument panel, and for the instrument panel, this is the gun sight up here, and this is the wheel that you would turn your mills, or you would adjust for what you were doing when you're bombing. I'm going to use this other one. When you were bombing or shooting guns, you would take and adjust the angle of the bomb sight, and that was tracked out to a specific range. So if your guns were sighted out at a particular range out there, and you put in that many mils, your gun sight would go to that angle, and then whatever was in the middle of that is what you got to shoot at. And if you were doing a bombing run, just lost my propeller and broke it. Oh, I'll have to glue it on again. Anyway, I hope that's not pressing. Anyway, bombing, most of our bombing runs were at 30 degrees, but we were also trained for high angle, which is 70-degree bombing. Now, the problem with 70 degrees is that kind of a flight path, but when an airplane gets fast, it tends to tuck under. So on a 70-degree bombing run like that, you're typically virtually hanging in your straps, looking straight down at the ground through your prop. And they would typically start anywhere from 12 to 18,000 feet. The thing is, the 70-degree angle like that was a very stable platform, and you were very accurate. We had an incredible high, I believe it was 30 feet CEP, which was with whatever we aimed at, we would put at least 50% of our ordnance in 30 feet of it, which when a bomb has a blast radius greater than that, means you probably are going to hit the target. So, and our circular error probability for rockets was down to 25 feet, so we were pretty accurate with that. Anyway, in the bombing mode like that, if you had your bomb sight all set up, then you had to check your airspeed, because you might have to adjust in your flying the whole time, plus you're being shot at. And you have to adjust your mils according to what your airspeed and your altitude is, and the altitude of the target, which you kind of have to know. So that was pretty complex. The whole right side, which we'll look at in a moment, was basically dedicated to electronics, and the whole left side to the mechanics. And the middle were all the flight instruments, and the armament panel was here, and this slot right here is where this was called, we called it the Ouija board, but it was a way to track your flight. And what you would do is this whole thing turns, and you can draw using a grease pencil. You can draw angles, and then you compute with your flight computer based upon your airspeed and allowing for wind. You could tell by how long you flew at that speed where you ought to be for distance. And you put a mark, and then if you had to change course, you change this course here and then start a new line, and you track that out. And the interesting thing is, for me, is that as a junior flight officer, I was really always somebody's wingman. I wasn't ever a section leader or a division leader. A section of planes was 2 planes, and a division was 2 planes, or 2 sections of 2 planes each for a 4, and that's the most we ever had in a formation at a time. So the junior people are typically a wingman on a more senior, experienced officer. The junior guy, we would have to do our plots as we were flying, and at the end of the flight, the senior guy would want to see your Ouija board, and he would compare it with his to see how accurate you were. Now, the reason for that was, as a nuclear qualified pilot, if I ever had to launch for my target, I had things set up for my target, and I would basically have to dead reckon the entire flight, because in case of nuclear war, after the first 15 minutes or so, there wouldn't be any kind of navigation things to work off of, so you'd have to be totally on dead reckoning. And in order to find where you were going to get to your target, you had to go typically over the water, which is kind of exciting because there are no mountains and no gas stations to look at to see where you are. So you just really have to trust yourself, and so we would pick up the wind direction and speed off of looking at the ocean, because we also flew between 50 and 100 feet off the water, and that was to stay under radar. And the interesting thing about a nuclear delivery, this is a scary fun part, we had a maneuver called the Whifferdale. Now, I do not know where that name has come from, but the Whifferdale is, if that was my target, I would fly in naked of the earth, and when I got to about a 45-degree angle from the target, I would pull my nose up and then roll over a 135-degree roll, and then pull the airplane through and roll out and be back down on the deck, and then I would drop my weapon, and then I would pull 2 Gs for 2 seconds to loft me up, and this is all on full combat power, by the way, and then I would lower my seat pan to the bottom and deflect the rear view mirror so that if the blast went off, it didn't blind me, and then I would ride out the blast wave. And they promised I would not be in the fireball. So all I had to do, and that's why the Navy planes were painted white on the bottom and the trailing edge of all the surfaces so that they wouldn't melt when the fireball was shooting all kinds of heat at you. Exciting, huh?
What was the yield of the weapons you were carrying?
Well, I carried a Mark 57, which was dialable between 4.5. Okay, so anyway, it would be set by the arming crew based upon your target at anywhere from 4.5 kilotons, which a Hiroshima is 20, so it could go up to 20. And they had another version of the Mark 57, and I don't want to remember the name of it because I might have to kill you if I told you. And it could go up to 50 KT, so 2.5 times Hiroshima. So anyway, depending on your target, I can say that my target was a Russian air base somewhere in Russia, of all places, and that my target was the airfield, and it was there I was supposed to drop my weapon in the middle of the airfield to crater the runway so it would be unusable. The only scary thing about that is because it would take me about 6.5 to 7 hours to get there, that there was probably an ICBM from Nebraska, and then a B-52 from Guam, and a tactical fighter from Tachikawa that had also hit it, so I figured I'd be glowing in the dark by the time I got to because I'd be flying through everybody else's atomic blasts. But anyway, and I figured that's a little bit overkill, probably, because four things aimed at a single airfield is a lot of weapons. And of course, then the thing was, once you drop your weapon, you take a heading and you egress towards what's left of Japan. And of course, the standard joke for many people was, well, yeah, that's one alternative. The other alternative is to disappear over the horizon, drop your weapon unsafe, and head for Australia. But no one ever would have done that. So anyway, that's the front end of the puppy. And this is the armament control that's down at the bottom there. And you see the yellow handle there. I have that on the handout. The interesting thing about this is actually where you select the outer stores, and there's 12 outer stores, and then there are 3 inners as well, and you can select what you're going to try to drop and the interval that you're going to shoot them. And then this is the gun armament switches, and we could either turn on the inboard pair of 20 millimeter or the outboard, or both of them. But in addition, if we were trying to stay on target for a long time, we had, and I'll switch over here to the right side, these are the radios, and this down here is a bunch of circuit breakers, and you could pull out a circuit breaker for a specific gun, so you could actually shoot the port gun outside or the port gun inside, so you could actually make 4 times as many passes. And why that was critical is we carried 800 rounds of 20 millimeter, roughly 200 rounds per gun. And if you look at the firing rate is was roughly 400 rounds a minute, and you do the math, you realize that you've only got about 15 seconds of actual firing. So if we were on a rest cap trying to keep people from collecting a pilot, we would want to make as many passes as possible. So if it looked like there was nobody coming short by, you might even pull the circuit breakers out and shoot 1 cannon at a time. But of course, when you did that, you'd have to use a lot of rudder to counteract the fact that the wing would want to fall back with the percussion from the recoil from the gun. And the 20 millimeter cannons were basically a version of the ones that had been developed in World War II, and the license was brought over and modified by the Americans and became the M3 something. I think it might be, I forgot. Anyway, it's a 20 millimeter cannon that we fired alternating HEI, high explosive incendiary, and armor piercing. So the armor piercing was just a solid slug, and the HEI had a fuse inside, and it would basically explode when it hit and cause fires. And that combination was really good against armor or hardened targets like a gun nest or a bunker or another airplane or trucks and tanks, things like that. Yeah, the HEI was a tracer because when it fired, it was burning inside, and basically the burn through to the point of explosion was about set at 800 yards. So when you would fire the guns, you would typically fire a kind of a short burst, like maybe a 1 or 2 second burst, see what that is, and then you would adjust. Because you're moving over the ground, if that burst was about right, then when you started to fire for effect, you would push forward on the stick slightly so that the airplane would concentrate all the rounds in that one area. And so if you're shooting at a truck or a machine gun nest or something like that, you don't want the bullets to come whipping through it and where only maybe 6 or 7 bullets would hit and then keep on going. You really want to start pouring it on there. So that was part of the strategy of that.
So your cannons were focused to merge, about 200 yards?
Yeah, they were, I believe that the arming, that the sighting, I believe was 800 yards.
So they merged about 800 yards in front of you?
Yeah, yeah. So anything short of that would be a little bit of spread. And anything beyond that, they would actually cross over. So the optimum was the 800 yards on the strafing run. And you just kind of judge that. It's about a half mile, quarter mile. Other questions about that? The exciting thing that, again, this is the electrical part. Hello? Wrong way. Okay. Back. Yep. And then the next side, that's the mechanical side. And this is the throttle. and this is the prop, and this is the mixture. And so when you were on a cat shot, what you would do is, first of all, the throttle would be kind of idling, and you'd be the prop would be max increase, and the mixture would be rich. And then when you would run up the engine for takeoff, you'd push everything forward and hold it with your thumb. And then there was a little bar right there that slid out, and you'd hook your fingers over that so that when the catapult shot, it wouldn't close the throttle. That would be a scary thing. So anyway, that's the inside, that's the business side of the whole thing. Hello? Let's talk just a little bit about carrier operation, and then I'm going to show my movie. How are we doing on time? Okay. On carrier operations, the exciting thing about a carrier is that it's out in the middle of nowhere, and your runway to land on is about 350 feet long, and it's about 100 feet wide. Now, so when you're coming up to the ship, they do what they call a Navy break, which is where you come right along. If this were the ship, you come right along looking down so that you could see any signals from the tower which was on the island. And then as you pull a beam, the first plane out, you would start into a turn, and in the turn you would throw out your gear, and then you would start the downwind. Meanwhile, the ship is going this way. So as soon as you were approaching a beam, the ship, you would start another turn, and your flaps are down, and your tail hook is down. And then at the 90 here, you're looking aboard to see if you can see what is called the meatball. And the meatball is a datum line of green lights and Fresnel lenses that are 5 thick like this. And the way that those are set up is that they have a glide slope that if you're on glide slope, the middle one is right there. And then there's 4 yellow ones and 1 red. If you see red, your glide slope is so low that you're running into the risk of hitting the back of the ship. So you want to get up a little. And then you've got these 2 that are kind of more optimal, and that's too high. And if you get if too high in your pass, you'll probably miss all the cables across the deck, and then you'll do what they call a bolter. You'd hit the deck, not get a wire, and go off the angled deck over the ocean again. Now, the difference between props and jets is that props have pretty good instantaneous thrust when you hit the throttle. The problem with the AD is, with that big prop, and between the P factor of the air hitting the rudder and the fact of the torque of the engine itself, when you cob full power on that thing, you basically had to have all the right rudder and all the right aileron in the world to keep it from flipping over on its back and going into the water. So, and that was especially tricky at night because you don't know where the water is. During the day, you have an idea, usually.
So you're saying it's got a lot of torque?
A lot of torque, a lot of torque. And that was actually what killed a lot of Corsair pilots, because the Corsair had that problem of a lot of torque at the time, and the sight of the deck, and they had to have a nose high, and they had a whole big nose out there, and trying to line up with the deck of the carrier was kind of tricky. And I'll show you, when I show you the movie, what the sight looked like coming around and actually landing aboard the carrier. So the carrier operations is a very exciting point. The only thing I want to make before I show you the movie is that, you know, you've all seen Top Gun or something like that, and you see all the various colored shirts everywhere. And each of the shirts has a specific function. The red shirts are basically ordnance people. The green shirts are mechanics. The yellow shirts are directors and catapult people. And the purple shirts are fuel. And the brown shirts are plane captains. Now in the Navy, plane captain is assigned to a specific plane, and that's all he does. He cleans the windscreen and he checks up for all the maintenance aspect and keeps it wiped down. Because these suckers really threw a lot of oil and a lot of hydraulic fluid, so they were constantly leaking things. So various tanks had to be filled and things wiped down. And they were also responsible for strapping you in as the pilot and making sure you had everything you needed. And then they would help start the engine. And the starting was this, and you would acknowledge that, and they would fire up the engine, and when the engine was fired up, they would pull the APU out of auxiliary power unit, and then they would turn the plane over to a plane director that would then taxi you, and they would advance you, trying to daisy chain you down the flight deck to the catapults. And then once on the catapults, the yellow shirts would control lining you up. And one thing some people ask about the hook out there, that is the hook that lowers down and catches the wire. On a carrier, there were 4 wires. The optimum wire was the number 2 wire. You didn't want the number 1 because that was so close, that indicated you might have had a ramp strike. And if you hit the end of the ship like that, that could break the back of the airplane and skitter parts of you across the deck, which wasn't very fun. And the number 3 wire was okay, but not as sharp as hitting the number 2 wire. And the number 4 was kind of scary because that was like the last ditch. Because if you missed that, you were going to go off and over to the water. And now with jets, one of the things, the difference between the prop planes and the jets, when the jets hit the deck like that, as soon as they hit the deck, they fly a constant angle of attack down to the, and when they hit, they immediately hit full power because the jet engine can take up to a second to spool up. And so if you don't do that and you missed a wire, you probably don't have enough oomph to get off the deck again, and then you go into the water. Now the nice thing about having an angled deck is if you go off the deck, you don't get run over by the ship. So that was a good thing. Now the scary part about that is to come aboard the ship, you've got this angle, the ship is going this way, the angled deck is that way, so you have to go over the wake, and then you have to line up kind of a relative motion because you're still chasing the deck down. And so it's a lot of depth perception and spatial relations to do that. The other thing that was interesting about A1s is jets fly the same attitude down and land. In the A1, because of our big prop, to come aboard the ship, when you roll out and you would open the canopy and hang your head like Casey Jones out into the wind so that you could see the ball as you rolled out on final. So if it was rainy, you got wind and rain in your face, and you're trying to come aboard the ship. Well, what happens is that the last minute when you get the cut, which are a bunch of green lights, when you get that cut, you have to actually chop the power, nose the nose down to fly down to the flight deck, and then flare out so that you didn't hit the prop on the deck. So that, for depth perception, is a challenging thing that the jets don't have to go through. They just fly it into the deck, which is why sometimes when you're flying commercial planes and they hit real hard, it was probably a Navy pilot. They're used to just flying it right into the deck. So anyway, that's a major difference because that prop you don't want to do. Also, another kind of humorous thing is that the tail wheel could be locked or it could pivot. On the carrier, you always wanted it to pivot so that they could move you around. When you went to land on the ground, you want to make sure that that tail wheel is locked, because as soon as the tail wheel comes down, if it's not locked, you're all over the runway, which we're a 50-foot wide airplane. There's not a lot of play in there, and that was always exciting. Okay, any questions so far?
Where's the catapult fasten on?
Okay, and the question was, where did the catapult pass it on? There are basically 2 loops. There's a yoke that fits on here, and then the yoke would come up out of the catapult and hook on there, and then there is, behind the tail wheel, there is another connector that they would put a bar of steel that was designed to break at a certain tensile point. And so what they would do, they would have to know the weight of your airplane that was going to be shot off the catapult, 25,000 pounds or 24,000, and they would choose one of those retainer links based upon your weight so that you could go up to full power on the engine and it would not release you. But the throw of the catapult was enough to break that. And of course you wouldn't want it to be too strong or pull the tail off the airplane. So there was math involved for the poor people that set that up. But the yoke, again, would throw you. Interesting thing on a carrier, my particular room was right under the arresting gear. And so how I was awakened to flight ops was boom, because a plane, really right under the flight deck. There was, and so my ceiling would come down about 6 inches and was like living inside of a bass drum, which is why I have tinnitus up the wazoo. So if you were under the arresting gear, you heard this boom of it hitting and then a whoo as the wires faded out as it slowed the airplane down. If you were one of the junior officers that was up in front between the catapults, it was a boom, because the catapult was accelerating, and at the end it would hit the water brake and it'd be a big boom. So I always thought, that's weird, because I was glad I spent the whole cruise in one environment. It'd be really weird. What if you heard sometime a whoop? You might wait the rest of your life for that boom, you know? It would be a scary thing. Any other questions before we move on to the movie? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and fire that up. A movie that I made from various Super 8mm. Now the exciting thing about this is I'm flying the airplane all by myself and then trying to take pictures, so formation flying gets a little ratty sometimes. But it was really beautiful. My favorite thing was an early morning flight, flying among the clouds, and it was really nice. This is Day Begins. This is called an unrep. Turn it down just a little bit. This is an unrep, or underway replenishment, where we may have a supply ship come alongside and fill us up with food for the people and spare parts, and also oil or gas or JP4. And so that was a real dance for them, moving close and swinging lines back and hoses back and forth. That still goes on today, although with the nuclear carriers, they don't need to take on bunker oil, except for they carry some aboard in case they need to replenish an older ship that still uses that. Most of the small boats are now have nuclear as well. There's a purple shirt dragging a fuel line. There's red shirt with a bomb rack. There's a brown shirt cleaning the windscreen. And there's a pilot. That was actually my roommate, Dale Pellet, who is now a retired dentist in Florida. So we all kind of scattered after the flight because there were no more A1s.
Folding wings.
Good what?
The wings fold.
Yes, they do. And actually, to load the bombs, they had to have the wings out, load the bombs on, then they could fold the wings up and store them that way, and they would taxi even that way, and then lower the wings down as they approach the catapult. I'm going to speed through some of the scenes because while it's real fun for me to watch, it's not as much fun for everybody else. These are A4s, and this squadron were the blue tail flies for obvious reason with their blue and white stripes.
Bob, you know, if you turn that on, I think it'll work if I turn this away.
Oh, okay. I'll try it.
Turn it on. And talk.
Yep. Okay. Am I back on?
Yeah.
Oh, that's better. There I am putting my flight helmet on. Oops. Is that a little loud? Anyway, that's a tractor with an ordnance man driving it. Can you turn this down just a little bit? And gentlemen, start your engines. There's a plane captain giving you the startup sign. And that's looking across the flight deck. The flight deck is a very dangerous place because you can get sucked into the intake of a jet, or in those days you could get whacked by a prop. We actually had 3 men killed walking into props, 2 of them during night and 1 during the day. And in night operations, you can only imagine because you can't see anything. And what had happened is they taxied one of the planes up behind, and the guy turned around to reach for a chain and got hit by the prop behind him and moved up. That's an F4 taking off, and there you see an E2. That particular, that's AEW now. And these are Spads. Again, you see them taxiing down and then they're spreading the wings just prior to hitting the catapult. And then as they get up into the catapult area, that yoke is attached to the front, they tie down to the back, and then they raise a blast detector. You just see it going up there. And that's to save the people on the deck from getting blown off the deck when jets or airplanes are taking off. And those aren't particularly heavily loaded. The ones during the Tet Offensive, in the middle of, or late January, when the Tet Offensive was happening in 1968, we were going off typically carrying 12 500-pounders and 2 750-pounders. Or in the case on February 7th, I was involved in the rescue of Special Forces Camp Langvay, which was a small camp part of Quezon. And that day I was carrying napalm as well as rockets because that camp had been overrun by the North Vietnamese, and they had that was the first time they used tanks in South Vietnam. And while the tanks were knocked out, they were swarming over the cement bunker, command bunker, and pouring gasoline and hand grenades down, trying to smoke out the 8 special forces that were in the command post. And so we had to use things that would not damage that concrete bunker. So basically rockets, the small rockets, and the guns were okay. And used the napalm off to drive away troops away that kept trying to get to the command post. And later, there you can see a full complement of the 12 250-pounders and 2 750-pounders with a centerline fuel tank. And this is a group of 4 planes.
Did you drop that fuel tank or did you bring it back?
We brought it back, but we could drop it in an emergency. It had a release for that. And sometimes we would fly double bubble, which is what those models have. They would have tanks. You can kind of watch that a bit while I talk. Out on the main wing pylons, they could either carry up to 3,000 or 2,000 pounds. So they could carry fuel tanks, and they were set up to draw fuel to a center point, and you could actually put a 3rd one here, and then triple bubble. Actually, they flew an A1 coast to coast from San Diego, North Island to Jacksonville in a single hop. That would have been ugly. And all you've got is a relief tube. So just try to have a liquid diet, I guess. Anyway, with the single tank like that, again, that would give us 300 plus the 400 internal, 700 gallons, and that would give us a flight range of about 9 hours if we were very careful with the mixture and the speed. You could also go through that in about 4 hours if you were cruising around in the middle of combat. But this is what the coast of North Vietnam looked like. And not much to see. It was basically rice paddies. Those are the two guns in the wing, and that's a rocket pod. It's kind of sticking down the bottom of that. Let's see if I can advance forward a little. Oh, this is fun, actually. This is gunfire spotting. We did that for the destroyers that would do gunfire in North Vietnam. We were basically there to spot their artillery, but also to cover, because if they got counter battery fire from the land, we were there to suppress those counter batteries, keep them from hurting the ship. Okay, this is actually some combat footage of taking down a bridge and a car and a park. If you look down there, you'll be able to see an explosion. Okay, next one. Oh, there's one kind of started. And there it's an explosion. I lost about 2/3 of my Super 8 to water damage in a garage that I had. I didn't know there was a leak, but it leaked into this cardboard box. I had all my 35 millimeter and most of my Super 8, so this is about all I could scavenge from that. I actually got about 30 minutes, of which about 18 minutes are useful. That was kind of heartbreaking. And then this is actual roll-in. That's what a roll-in would look like.
Did the planes have cameras for it?
Yeah, they had gun camera on the right side, but they didn't let us have any of that shot, so I had to use my Super 8 Sony. And that's flying really close to my roommate, and me with one hand on a camera. I think he was flying on me, because usually the plane that's in the lead, all they have to do is just be very, very calm and very, very smooth. And then the other guy gets all over the place trying to fly on him. And the worst part is being number 4 of a flight of 4, because anything that's a movement of the flight gets accentuated. So by the time you get to the number 4, you're washing out the inside of the cockpit with throttle and reducing throttle and rudder, and this is actually will come up to land. That's the gun sight. I'm actually sitting in one of the VA-W13 airplanes. Side by side, I'm sitting in the co-pilot or the radar intercepts. And you'll see that. You'll actually see his orange-colored screen. Now you can see we're going to go across the wake there. So we're actually across the wake and coming aboard. The meatball is right here, and you can just barely see it. It's a datum line of green lights, and then the meatball will be very bright in the middle. You receive the cut, bring her aboard, and you don't need to use any brakes, because in fact, you don't really want to use brakes. If you use brakes, you might stop shorter than the wire and disconnect the wire, and then you go piddling over the edge of the deck. And then I'll stop it here, because the rest of it is really for my squadron. Anyway, the rest of it is a memorial to the folks in the squadron. Of our 14 pilots, basically at this point, the last reunion, only half of them are still living, because most of the pilots in the squadron we had a rank-heavy squadron, because for many of them, they were lieutenant commanders, which is a major, and this was the last chance to get some kind of combat time, so that for their careers. So this was the last shot. They really weren't going to transition to jets and do anything else, but it was an opportunity to at least get some combat time for their careers. So we had a lot of those. We only had 3 of us very junior O2s. I would start off as a Lieutenant JG in the cruise, or actually an ensign started the cruise and then became a JG. All right, that's about it for me. I think we can cut it, and if any of you have any questions, I'll be up here. I've got have an example of a flight jacket, which I can no longer wear because I put on about 30 pounds since then. But it's pretty old. My wonderful wife bought me a new one. I just need to get new patches made. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate being here today.